Love that remains. An inquiry. Second movement. Relationship as revelation. By Liz Eaglesnake. June 10th, 2026. Wait, he said. I said what? The question stopped me in my tracks. I had replayed the interaction innumerable times, turning it over from every angle, examining the wording, the implications, the meaning, the feeling it had left behind. I knew exactly which sentence had hurt and what I thought it had meant. Above all, I knew exactly why it had affected me so deeply. So when he asked me with genuine confusion, something inside me paused. Not because he was denying the conversation, not because I feared my experience wasn't real, but because his confusion was genuine. For days, I had been living inside the consequences of something that, from his perspective, had never happened in the way I experienced it. The event occurred, the conversation happened, the feelings were real. Yet somehow, we had been living inside entirely different versions of the same conversation. And the more I sat with the realization, the more interested I became in a completely different question. How does the same moment become two different realities? In the previous movement, Chinamaster severs a thread. The thread that was severed was the need to continuously translate, to explain, to clarify, to help another person understand what I was seeing. What interested me afterward was not the severing itself. It was the question the severing left behind. What was the nature of that need? Because what stayed with me was not the story I had constructed. It was the fact that there was a story at all. And I had been relating to that story as if it were reality. And once that became apparent, a different question emerged. How does interpretation happen in the first place? For a long time, I thought intimacy was the deepest thing relationship offered. I no longer believe that. Or perhaps more accurately, I no longer think intimacy means what I thought it meant. Most conversations about intimacy focus on being seen, being understood, being accepted, being loved despite what another person discovers about us. All of which matters, of course, but over the last few months another question has been quietly following me. A question I have not been able to shake. What if the thing preventing intimacy is not whether I am seen, but whether I am present at all? Not present to another person, present to my own experience. Because before another person can meet me, I must already be there. That's why I think relationship equals revelation. Relationship reveals what we love, what we fear, what we protect, what we avoid, what we assume, what we worship, what we believe. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals how we organize reality, through presence or through story. It reveals the invisible architecture through which reality becomes a different experience for each of us. And this is what I have become increasingly interested in, what I've called self-referential interference. The tendency to encounter ourselves before we encounter what is actually happening. What does this mean about me? Am I safe? Am I loved? Am I enough? What should I do? How should I respond? Most people assume these questions create closeness to experience. I am no longer convinced. Sometimes they can create distance. Not from another person, but from reality itself. Because attention becomes occupied by interpretation before contact has fully occurred, and relationship exposes this relentlessly, because it illuminates what is already there. And perhaps this is why relationship can feel so confronting. Not because relating to another person is inherently difficult, but because another person makes visible what would otherwise remain hidden. What we discover in relationship is not only the other person. We discover the structures through which we experience them, and through them ultimately reality. Again and again, through attraction, through conflict, through longing, through misunderstanding, through devotion, through love. And perhaps this is where my understanding of intimacy began to change. because what relationship was revealing was not only another person, but the way I was meeting life itself. What if intimacy has less to do with being seen and more to do with contact? Which brings me back to what kept getting in the way. Self-referential interference does not look like avoidance in the traditional sense. People are there, they show up, they speak, they engage, they connect. But something is slightly off. Not broken, not traumatic, just slightly filtered. It's not that people are absent, it's that part of their attention is continuously occupied. And that changes everything. Instead of consciousness meeting experience directly, there is a middle layer. A constant low-level orientation toward, what does this mean about me? How am I coming across? What should I say next? Is this safe? Am I too much? Not enough? Even when silent, it runs in the background. Not always as words, sometimes as tension, as a pause that doesn't belong, as a quiet disconnection from the immediacy of the moment. And this is where the feeling of disconnection first begins, not between people, but within the person themselves. Because intimacy does not begin between two people. It begins when nothing stands between you and reality. When you are not monitoring, adjusting, or positioning yourself inside your own life. When you simply there. In my experience, most people don't lack desire for intimacy. What they lack is access to undivided presence. And so we often mistake intimacy for negotiated closeness, mutual regulation, shared vulnerability, emotional exchange, all of which can be beautiful, all of which may accompany intimacy, but none of which are intimacy in its pure form. Because intimacy does not require effort, it requires the absence of interference. And this is where it becomes confronting. Because self-referential interference is not something we consciously choose. It's patent, protective, forged through years of needing to orient, adapt, survive, belong. And what it calls for is not condemnation, only the willingness to notice. When the interference is seen clearly, without trying to change it, something begins to soften. The referencing loosens, the internal distance collapses, and what remains is something very simple: contact. Not intense, overwhelming, or performative, just direct, unmediated, and alive in a way that does not need to prove itself. And perhaps this is what intimacy feels like when nothing is standing in front of it. I have had the opportunity to touch this kind of presence before, not in isolation, but in relationship, when nothing was being managed internally. No self was being constructed in real time, and yet I was fully there with the other, without leaving myself, without inserting myself between me and the moment. That is intimacy, not something created, but something revealed when what interferes is no longer running the show. And maybe this is why it feels so rare, not because it's hard to reach, but because we really are not interfering. So the question shifts from, why does intimacy sometimes feel just out of reach, to, what is it in me that is constantly placing me at a distance from reality? And what happens when, even for a moment, that stops? Over time, I have come to think of these as two modes of experience. The first, self-referential interference. The second, non-referential coherence. Some traditions call it abidance. Others call it presence, union, or non-dual awareness. The first organizes experience through the self. The second allows experience to be met before it becomes organized into meaning. Not because the self disappears or because identity dissolves, but because experience no longer requires constant interpretation in order to be touched. The moment arrives and it's met. The person arrives and is met. Reality arrives and is met, without the immediate need to manage what is happening. This does not feel like detachment. If anything, it feels like greater intimacy. Not intimacy with another person. Intimacy with oneself as a pathway to intimacy with reality. And while the traditions have described this state in many ways, what interests me is not the terminology. What interests me is that relationship appears capable of revealing both its absence and its possibility. Because relationship continuously exposes the place where consciousness contracts around identity, and occasionally through love, grief, beauty, devotion, or simple presence, those contractions soften. For a moment, the self is no longer standing between awareness and experience, and reality becomes startlingly close. The irony is that it often arrives dressed as something completely ordinary, not because nothing is happening, but because so little stands between awareness and experience. It does not feel extraordinary from within itself, but there is a characteristic spaciousness to it, as though awareness had become wider than the thoughts attempting to describe what is happening. More room around experience, more room around thought, more room around oneself. It is only later, in reflection, that one realizes how extraordinary the experience was, because for a moment there was no distance between awareness and experience. The sound of rain arriving without immediately becoming a memory, a conversation unfolding without preparing the next sentence, a moment of grief that is allowed to be grief before it becomes a story, the face of a loved one appearing before the mind brings comparing, evaluating, remembering, and anticipating. Reality simply arrives, with less of me standing in front of it, and reality becomes unobstructed. Not enhanced, not transcended, not improved, unobstructed, allowing for contact before interpretation. Because thought is no longer standing between consciousness and experience. There is less management, less positioning, less negotiation, less performance. Reality simply arrives and finds awareness already paying attention. And perhaps this is all non-referential coherence really is, a temporary absence of interference, a moment in which experience is allowed to be itself before it becomes about us. Ultimately, one could say that not referential coherence is not the absence of self, but the absence of self-preoccupation. Therefore, I no longer think intimacy is something we create. I think intimacy is what remains when interference softens. When explanation pauses and certainty relaxes. When reality is allowed to arrive before it is interpreted. When obsession with the self drops. Not creating perfect contact or permanent contact. Just contact. Direct, immediate, alive. And perhaps this is why relationship matters so much. Not because it completes us, not because it validates us, not because it saves us, but because relationship is not merely something we experience. It is one of the ways reality reveals itself. Relationship is the teacher. Presence is the syllabus. Truth is what emerges, and love, well, love is what remains. An invitation. If anything in this essay feels familiar, I would like you to sit with a few questions. Where in my life am I relating to an interpretation rather than reality? What forms of protection have become so familiar that I mistake them for myself? What becomes significant to the people I love that I myself rarely notice? What experiences continue asking for my attention? What truth keeps returning because they are asking to be seen? And perhaps most importantly, what remains when I stop defending who I have been long enough to discover who I am becoming? And if you are ready to deepen in your experience of love, I invite you into our collective field. These are the questions that gave birth to Love That Remains. Not a space devoted to fixing relationships, a field devoted to revelation through relationship, a place where curiosity becomes more important than certainty, a place where truth is given enough room to emerge in its own time, and where together we discover what remains. in loving presence. Liz Eaglesnake.